It's Friday, March 18th, 2022. 23 days of war. In Ukraine, Russia invaded Ukraine on false pretenses on February 24th with aims of demilitarizing and denazifying their western neighbor. Since then, Russia has added another charge, chemical weapons, for which no evidence exists. Russia has bombed healthcare workers, medical sites, and facilities 31 times. Dozens of schools and preschools have been bombed. UNICEF estimates at least 750 schools have been damaged or destroyed by Russian artillery since 2014, when fighting in the Donbass region began. Over 3 million Ukrainian refugees have fled the country since the war began, and the Ukrainian government estimates at least 3,000 civilians have been killed in Mariupol and Kharkiv alone. The UN puts the number much lower, at around 816 civilian fatalities. Our previous episode explains why accurate numbers are difficult to gather. One of the hardest-hit areas, Mariupol, a port city in the southeast of Ukraine, has been cut off from supplies and all major utilities and is blockaded by Russian troops to the north and Russian naval vessels in the Azov Sea to the south. A peacetime population of 400,000, it's estimated that some 300,000 are effectively trapped in the city. City officials have reported that residents have taken to melting snow for drinking water, and some have resorted to drinking from puddles. We've reported on this before, and the situation has not changed. Though the area has some natural springs and deep wells, the natural supply of water is not nearly enough for all the residents stuck there. We reported earlier this week that Mariupol's Drama Theater and Neptune Pool, two locations used as bomb shelters, were directly hit by Russian airstrikes on March 16th. At the Drama Theater, nearly 1,500 residents had taken shelter in the building's basement. Satellite images provided by Maxar Technologies show the word children written in Russian at both the front and rear of the building, a clear attempt to protect the building from Russian airstrikes. As of today, Friday, March 18th, Ukraine's Human Rights Commissioner Lyudmila Denisova reported that some 1,300 civilians are trapped in the theater's basement. Only 130 have been successfully rescued from the shelter. The Neptune Pool, which is a municipal pool that was undergoing construction to become a training facility for Ukraine's Paralympic swimmers, was used as a bomb shelter by pregnant women and women with children. The Neptune Pool is about 4 kilometers away from the Drama Theater. Donetsk Regional Governor Pavlo Kyrylenko reported that the number of civilians sheltering in the pool is unknown, and no information about survivors has been published. Belkis Vil, senior researcher for Human Rights Watch, said of the bombing on the theater and pool, quote, "This raises serious concerns about what the intended target was in a city where civilians have already been under siege for days and telecommunications, power, water, and heating have been almost completely cut off," end quote. Russian Defense Ministry denied bombing the locations, offering an alternative story that they keep falling back on. The Azov Battalion, a far-right faction of the Ukrainian military, had performed the attack, and Russia offered zero evidence of this. Mariupol Mayor Vadim Boychenko, in an exchange with BBC's Hugo Beshega, described the current situation in Mariupol, quote, "There's no city center left. There isn't a small piece of land in the city that doesn't have signs of war," end quote. He estimates more than 80% of the city's residential buildings have been destroyed. Captain Sviatoslav Palomar, deputy commander of the Azov Regiment, issued the following account on the situation in Mariupol. Quote, "At the time when I'm talking to you, street fights in the city are going on. Enemy aircraft and artillery are working nonstop. The city is being leveled to the ground," end quote. Yesterday, March 17th, in Chernihiv, northeast Ukraine, nearly 700 kilometers away from Mariupol, Ukrainian authorities reported that 10 citizens waiting in a bread line were killed by, quote, "heavy artillery attack" from Russian forces. Chernihiv has been under attack by Russian troops since February 25th, 2022, and have been shelling the city center constantly. Hospitals, schools, and residential buildings have been regular targets for Russia's BM-21 Grad multiple rocket systems. Just over a week ago, March 10, Chernihiv's mayor Vyacheslav Atrashenko reported that Russia had successfully encircled the entire city despite fierce resistance from Ukrainian troops and civilians. Total civilian casualties in Chernihiv approach 170. Chernihiv's head of regional administration, Vyacheslav Chaus, speaking on Ukrainian television about the shelling on those waiting in the breadline, said, quote, "This is not the first such incoming shell in the city, nor is it the first shelling of civilians by the enemy. The Russians are shelling and destroying mostly civilian infrastructure in the city of Chernihiv and other cities in the region," end quote. Spokesperson for the Russian Ministry of Defense, Major General Igor Konashenkov, denied the bombing. Quote, Today, video footage of civilians who died in Chernihiv, who were allegedly shot by Russian servicemen, was distributed on all propaganda resources by the Kiev regime. It was indicated that all the dead allegedly stood in line for bread. I would like to emphasize that there were no Russian servicemen in Chernihiv. All Russian troops are outside of Chernihiv." End quote. Based on additional reporting since the March 17th bombing, it appears Konashenkov's statement is accurate. Russian troops did not shoot those in the breadline from inside the city with rifles. It appears that Russian troops launched rocket attacks from the outskirts of the city, indiscriminately killing civilians as they waited in line for food, which has been difficult to get with Russian forces surrounding the area. In Lviv, western Ukraine, 70 kilometers from the Polish border, after a missile attack on a Ukrainian military base this past Sunday left 35 dead and 134 wounded, Russian forces had been relatively quiet until today, Friday, March 18th. At 6:15 a.m., air raid sirens began to sound across the city. And 15 minutes later, an aircraft repair plant 6 kilometers from the Lviv city center was struck by Russian cruise missiles. 6 missiles were launched, and the Ukrainian Air Force intercepted 2 of them. No casualties or fatalities were reported. Up until last week, the far western city had been untouched by Russian forces. Lviv served as a humanitarian hub for supplies brought into the country and refugees fleeing the country. It was a safe destination for evacuees making their way by train, bus, or car. The missiles are believed to be Kh-555s. That's a subsonic air-launched missile with a range of up to 2,500 kilometers. They are believed to have been fired from the south via a heavy air bomber. March 16th, Novokakova City Council Secretary Dmytro Vasilyev was reported to have been abducted and detained. Lyudmila Vasilieva, his wife, said, quote, "I started searching for him, and the only thing I know is that he is allegedly in the basement of the police building, which was seized by Russian forces. I was able to send him a parcel there, but I don't know if he received it or not. I've also written a statement to the prosecutor's office about his disappearance." End quote. She believes her husband is being tortured to pressure him into supporting the Russian occupation. Vasilyev is just one of many abductions carried out by Russian troops to date. Mariupol's mayor Ivan Fedorov was abducted on March 11th. The mayor of Dnipro-Rudny, Ivan Matviev, was abducted on March 13th. Mayor of Skadovsk, Alexander Yakovlev, his deputy Yuri Polyuk, and Novokakova's Dmitry Vasilyev, all abducted March 16th. Fedorov has been released. No news on the others. The situation in Ukraine, all over the place, is bad. Most analysts and news reports have determined that Russia's advance has mostly stalled, which is just as bad as if it were progressing. Frustrated and presumably overextended, the Russian military has resorted to blind bombardment. That's the hopeful scenario. That's the fingers crossed scenario. That a bunch of grunts are aiming rockets without considering their targets. The alternative is that Russia is targeting civilians on purpose, the bulk of whom are women, children, and the elderly. The alternative is that targeting civilians is a negotiation tactic for Russia. As long as Russia can deny the intentional murder of women and children, which is forever, they will never admit it, they will continue to murder them in an effort to push Ukraine into surrender. I can't fix that with this podcast. As we enter the 4th week of this war, I'll tell you that the updates on Mariupol, surrounded by troops and cut off from basic necessities, hurt the same every single time I read them, write them, and record them. There is no joy in watching javelins land on a Russian transport vehicle because that is just a small victory in a static stream of terror. Journalists being shot, children trapped under debris, and the vicious lies propagated by Russia to both dehumanize their victims and spread malice around the world. Is this even war? When we saw Ukrainian citizens making Molotov cocktails and picking up rifles handed out by their government, was that war? It lacks the logic of war in its brutal order. By all measures, Russia's lethal invasion lacks even the farce of rationality. Its demands are nonsensical. Demilitarization, denazification, recognition of the Donbass and Crimea. None of this is Russia's concern. It has no basis. Russia is no part of Ukraine. Russia has no say in these things. I was at first willing to assume some basis, however flimsy or even fabricated, for all these claims. I have eagerly awaited some presentation of phony evidence. At least we in the United States were appeased with enlarged photos of covered vehicles that proved the existence of weapons of mass destruction. And on that false evidence, the U.S. committed atrocities against the Arab world. Russia has not even granted us that offense. They provide paper claims, intelligence memos, the way one launders money on a false ledger with a straight face. When Russia arrives at a negotiation with no authority to sign a ceasefire, what fault does the world bear for Russia's cruelty? Zelensky isn't serious about peace? Russia is being generous, fair? Russia is being courteous, even courteous as their troops continue the shelling against women and children? Russia lacks agency, but it is Ukraine that lacks sincerity. Are the victims at the hospitals responsible for their own deaths? The Azov Battalion, 2,500 in number, magically occupies every building whose debris crushes its inhabitants. Mariupol has been nearly obliterated. Where exactly does the Azov Battalion hide? Russia bombs its own imagination. Is that war? We have rules for how to spill the blood of our enemies, however grotesque that is. Codified in 1949, the Geneva Convention tells us how to be cruel. Would we bless this invasion if Russia were to abide strictly to its protocols? If we had no civilian deaths but the same level of destruction, hundreds of billions of dollars in damage to Ukraine's major cities, the capture of a nuclear power plant, Zaporizhia, the capture of Chernobyl, the destruction of its airports and theaters and city buildings, would that destruction somehow be more acceptable? This is the metric by which Russia gauges our ignorance. They would have us believe the figments in the hospitals, the bunkers, the apartments. They need us to believe those figments have called them like the sirens of some holy battlefield. Is that war? Willful killing, willful injury, hostages. You could call all of Mariupol a hostage. Destruction of property with no military merit, unlawful transfer. These grave breaches of convention flaunted while Russia says the figments are there. The figments merit all their missiles, all their tanks. Figments hiding in Mariupol one moment, Kharkiv the next. They appear in Odessa and Lviv to taunt Putin. And like a warrior, Putin strikes. He strikes at everything, yet he always misses. We only see civilian corpses emerge from the rubble. His enemy is not among those dead. His mouthpieces tell us Ukraine is lying. Footage caught by journalists, caught by citizens with smartphones, uploading in real time to a global network of rapt onlookers. They are the propaganda machine that hides the figments from the world. Imagine, no one in the country you destroy sends a message of thanks. No one welcomes you. Is that liberation? Russia will not admit that they have missed a single target, won't admit they've killed a single civilian. To do that would be to admit Ukrainians merit the consideration of humanity. Of course, Russia has made no tactical errors. They have gone to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians. It is not a degradation to call this genocide. For Putin, the death of civilians is the point. Russia says its military operation is going smoothly. If Ukraine is no country, if Ukraine is only an appendage of Soviet Russia, then Ukrainians are no people. This, to Putin, justifies the cruelty. But to Russia there is no cruelty. That is the fevered reality of this slaughter. For Putin, Russian troops dying by the thousands are a meager fee in exchange for unleashed hell. Putin expects of us the same disinterest and cynicism he feeds to the people of Russia. He expects a faint, if not open, hostility to intervention. He expects to march in and pound to rubble the lives of 40 million and bear the mantle of a hero. He expects us to feed on the figments he pulls from his own mind and sink into the complicity with which we view all global conflict. That doesn't change who dies, but spreads their blood across all our hands. He expects us to bear that blood with him as we shake in fear of nuclear war, as we abide by the rules we set for ourselves, the same rules he ignores. He expects that blood to soak us all, for us to swim in it, oblivious to his utter hatred and disdain for us all. Putin has told us a half-truth. He has said that Russia is not at war with Ukraine. But he's admitted that Ukraine, too, is a figment. Only when the country has been leveled will the story change. Ukraine? There was never Ukraine. He would have us bear the blood of ghosts and ask us what we meant by war. Should we bear this blood and remember his wholesale slaughter, it will be no figment. There will be no denying it, no hiding from it. We'll know it was war. It will stain our memory. As always, we encourage you to check out helpingtoleave.org. That is an independent network of Russian activists who are helping Ukrainians get medical aid, food, clothing, and even escape Ukraine, as in they're doing it right now as we speak. They work round the clock, 24/7. It is a network of over 300 volunteers who coordinate a Telegram channel with over 95,000 members to make sure Ukrainians get the help they need. helpingtoleave.org.